Imagine Europe at the dawn of the 9th century. Mist curling over endless forests, tribes and kingdoms scattered like fragments of a forgotten story. The Roman Empire has long collapsed, but its ghost still wanders through the ruins, whispering of unity and greatness. Out of this fog steps a man whose name will echo for centuries, Charlemagne. Crowned by the Pope in the year 800, Charlemagne becomes Emperor of the Romans, though the empire he rules is nothing like the marble cities of ancient Rome. It is a patchwork realm of Frankish warriors, bishops, and scholars. Still, his coronation plants a seed that Europe can be bound together again, not by blood alone, but by faith. His empire stretches from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, a mosaic of cultures speaking dozens of tongues, yet praying in one language. Charlemagne dreams of order. He founds schools, sends out royal envoys, and calls councils to standardize law and worship. In his court at Aachen, monks copy manuscripts by hand while outside. Farmers till fields under banners marked with the cross. It feels, for a generation, as if a new Roman dawn is rising. But when Charlemagne dies, the light dims quickly. His heirs quarrel, carving the empire into pieces until the great dream fractures. Over the next century, new powers emerge from those fragments. In the east, Saxons rise, fierce and ambitious. From their ranks comes Otto the Great, crowned emperor in 962. He revives the old idea, the Holy Roman Empire. But his version is less a single kingdom than a loose confederation held together by oaths and ceremony. The church blesses his rule, yet the blessing comes with chains. Popes and emperors wrestle for control, each claiming divine authority. As the centuries turn, this empire becomes a living contradiction, holy, Roman, and imperial in name, but German in its heart and medieval in its reality. Every duke, prince, and bishop governs his domain, almost like an independent country. The emperor travels constantly, seeking loyalty town by town, castle by castle. Sometimes the crown feels more like a burden than a prize. Then comes Frederick Barbarossa, a ruler who burns with the old ambition of Charlemagne. His red beard becomes a symbol of strength and legend. He reforms laws, asserts imperial power, and leads armies into Italy to remind the papacy who truly wears the crown. His court glitters with pageantry. Poets and knights thrive under his reign. For a moment, unity seems possible again. But power in medieval Europe is slippery. The Italian wars drain his strength, and when he drowns during a crusade, the dream sinks with him. His grandson, Frederick II, inherits both the title and the impossible expectations. He is unlike any emperor before him, curious, multilingual, a lover of science and poetry. In an age of faith, he dares to think rationally. In a world of crusades, he negotiates with the enemy. To the church, he is a heretic. To historians, a man centuries ahead of his time. Yet brilliance cannot save him from politics. The popes excommunicate him repeatedly, the princes rebel, and the empire's authority crumbles once more. By 1250, the Holy Roman Empire still exists on parchment, but its spirit drifts like smoke. The emperor's word carries less weight than a bishop's blessing, and local rulers grow comfortable with their independence. What began as Charlemagne's unified dream has turned into 1,000 whispered versions of it. Germany is not one land, but many, a labyrinth of loyalties stitched together by ceremony, not conviction. Still, something enduring lingers beneath the fragmentation. The idea of a shared destiny, of a holy purpose linking the German peoples to the legacy of Rome, refuses to die. It sleeps within abbeys, within chronicles, within the memory of those who tell the story. The empire, though fractured, continues to breathe. As the 13th century closes, Europe stands at a crossroads. Faith and ambition have built a fragile world, glittering on the surface but cracking beneath. The printing of ideas has not yet begun. The storms of reformation and revolt still sleep beyond the horizon. For now, the Holy Roman Empire dreams on, half awake, half forgotten, waiting for the next voice to call it back to life. And as you drift forward through time, the chant of monks fades into murmurs of dissent, and the sound of swords sharpening on stone becomes the rhythm of the coming centuries. The dream of unity is not dead. It is merely turning in its sleep. After the death of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Empire entered a long and uneasy silence. Power no longer flowed from a single throne, but scattered like coins across the map. Germany, if it could even be called that, was not a nation, but a tangled forest of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. Every valley had its own ruler, every hill its own law. The emperor's crown passed from one ambitious noble to another, and none of them could truly command the others. This period, later called the Great Interregnum, felt like a dream dissolving. With no emperor strong enough to hold the reins, trade guilds, merchant towns, and small lords filled the vacuum. The Hanseatic League rose along the northern coast. Merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and dozens of ports joining forces to defend their interests. Their fleets sailed through fog and frost, weaving the North and Baltic seas into a single marketplace. Gold, fur, wax, and fish moved through their harbors. The smell of salt and coin defined northern life. Inland, towns grew proud and defiant. Nuremberg and Augsburg became centers of craft and art. Burghers built tall houses and stone churches as if wealth itself could sanctify them. Slowly, the empire's strength shifted from the sword to the ledger, from the monastery to the counting house. Yet prosperity did not mean peace. Princes quarreled endlessly, forging alliances one month and breaking them the next. By the 15th century, change was stirring in deeper ways. In Mainz, a craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg built a machine that pressed words onto paper faster than any monk's hand could copy them. His invention, the printing press, was not just a tool, but a revolution. Ideas that once crawled from one monastery to another now flew across Europe. Books multiplied, and knowledge, once the treasure of the few, became the weapon of the many. Then, in 1517, a quiet scholar in the small town of Wittenberg struck the blow that would shake Christendom. Martin Luther, angered by the sale of indulgences and the corruption of the clergy, nailed 95 theses to a church door. His act was both simple and seismic. The word spread like wildfire through Gutenberg's press. Within months, every tavern, every parish, every noble court was arguing about salvation, power, and truth. What had been a theological debate turned into a revolution of conscience. Many princes saw in Luther's challenge not just faith, but opportunity. By siding with reform, they could free themselves from the heavy hand of Rome and seize church lands. Others, loyal to the old faith, clung to the papal banner. Across the empire, neighbors became enemies overnight. The Peasants' War of the 1520s burst from this unrest. Common folk, inspired by talk of divine equality, rose against their masters, believing God had called them to freedom. But the rebellion was crushed with merciless force. Thousands died in fields that would later bear their names. Luther himself, horrified by the violence, turned against the peasants, choosing order over revolution. His reformation survived, but the unity of the German soul fractured beyond repair. The emperors of the Habsburg dynasty tried to bring order. Charles V, ruling both Spain and the empire, dreamed of a universal Christian monarchy. Yet his vast realm was too large, his enemies too many. He fought wars against France, against the Ottomans, and finally against his own Protestant princes. Even his victories were temporary. The old medieval vision of a single faith under a single emperor had become impossible. At last, exhaustion forced compromise. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg was signed, declaring cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each ruler could decide the faith of his land. It was not tolerance, merely a truce, but it stopped the bleeding. By the middle of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork more vivid than ever before. Protestant Saxons beside Catholic Bavarians, free cities trading with both, and scholars debating the nature of God in candlelit rooms. The age of faith had become the age of argument. Yet beneath the surface calm, the embers still glowed. The question of belief had been postponed, not answered. The next generation would inherit a divided world, and when those embers caught again, they would light the darkest fire Europe had ever seen. The dream of unity now flickered weakly, half buried under the ashes of conviction. And as the century closed, the sound of prayers began to mingle once more with the drumbeat of war. The Peace of Augsburg had given the empire a fragile calm, a pause between storms. But it was the kind of peace that breathes heavily in its sleep, waiting for the next shout. Germany remained a quilt of powers, some Catholic, some Protestant, all jealous of one another. The emperor in Vienna claimed authority, but his voice was a distant echo in a land of hundreds of thrones. In this uneasy silence, one question haunted the empire. Could two truths, two faiths, live under one sky? By the early 17th century, that question was about to be answered with fire. It began in Bohemia, a restless kingdom on the empire's edge. In 1618, Protestant nobles, furious at the emperor's attempts to suppress their faith, stormed into Prague Castle. Words turned to shouts, shouts to violence, and in one surreal moment, they threw two imperial officials out of a window. They survived the fall, but Europe would not survive what followed. This act, the defenestration of Prague, was the spark that set the world ablaze. The conflict that erupted would last 30 years, devouring generations. It started as a rebellion and became a war that drew in nearly every major power on the continent. Religion provided the banner, but ambition carried the sword. Catholic princes marched to defend the emperor. Protestant rulers called upon allies from abroad. Denmark entered the fray, then Sweden under its brilliant king Gustavus Adolphus, and finally France, ironically Catholic, joined the Protestants to weaken the Habsburg crown. The Holy Roman Empire became a battlefield without end. Armies trampled through villages, burning crops and stealing livestock. Cities like Magdeburg were razed until nothing remained but smoke and screams. Soldiers fought less for faith than for survival, looting to stay alive. Mercenaries changed sides as often as the seasons. The war swallowed everything: homes, harvests, hope. For ordinary people, it was apocalypse. Famine and disease spread faster than rumor. Roads were lined with corpses. Fields turned into graves. Travelers rode of villages where no dogs barked and no children played. Some regions lost half their population. The empire, already divided by belief, now fractured under suffering. Yet amidst the ruin walked legends. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, marched through Germany like a storm of discipline and purpose, claiming divine mission. His victory stunned the Catholic armies, and for a moment it seemed the Protestant cause might triumph. But in 1632, on the field of Lutzen, he fell in battle, his body left among thousands. The war stumbled on, directionless but relentless. Years dragged by. Generals sought glory. Diplomats sought meaning. The original cause, faith, had drowned beneath layers of vengeance and exhaustion. Even the victors were starving. The empire's land, once the heart of Europe, had become its wound. At last, after 3 decades of ruin, weary voices met at the negotiation table. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, ended the nightmare. It did not restore unity, it confirmed division. Each German prince gained the right to choose his state's religion and to make his own alliances. The emperor remained in title, but not in power. The dream of a united Christendom died quietly, replaced by the modern idea of the sovereign state. When the smoke cleared, Germany was not reborn, but scarred. Its cities rebuilt from ashes, its people from silence. The war had stripped away illusions of empire, of holy purpose, of divine order. What remained was endurance. In the candlelit ruins of monasteries, new thinkers began to wonder whether the world could be governed by reason rather than revelation. The medieval spirit was gone. Something new and uncertain was stirring. From the darkness of war, the age of enlightenment was beginning to whisper. And so, the dream, battered but unbroken, turned once more in its sleep, restless, haunted, and ready to awaken into a different world. When the thunder of war finally faded, the Holy Roman Empire was unrecognizable. What had once been the proud skeleton of Charlemagne's dream now resembled a mosaic cracked by fire. The Peace of Westphalia had ended the slaughter, but it also carved the empire into hundreds of nearly sovereign states. Princes ruled like kings, bishops like princes, and the emperor in Vienna presided over it all as a figurehead, more symbol than ruler. Germany had survived, but only by dissolving itself into fragments. In this fragile new world, exhaustion gave way to rebuilding. Cities like Leipzig, Hamburg, and Frankfurt hummed with trade again, their markets full of cloth, books, and beer. Farmers returned to their scorched fields, planting not just crops, but hope. The empire's people were weary, but they had learned endurance from centuries of turmoil. Where faith had once divided them, a quiet practicality began to unite them. The 17th century's later decades saw the rise of 2 rival powers that would shape Germany's future: Austria and Prussia. The Austrian Habsburgs, still wearing the imperial crown, turned their gaze eastward toward Hungary and the Balkans, fighting the Ottoman Empire and building a vast, multi-ethnic realm. In the north, the small and disciplined state of Brandenburg, Prussia, grew under the iron will of its rulers. Their armies were small but precise, their administration cold and efficient. The contrast between Baroque Vienna and Spartan Berlin would become the axis on which German destiny turned. Meanwhile, ideas began to move faster than armies. Across Europe, thinkers challenged the old order of faith and monarchy. This was the Age of Enlightenment, when men like Leibniz, Kant, and Lessing filled the German mind with reason. Universities, salons, and printing presses became new battlegrounds, not of blood, but of ideas. The old medieval world, with its saints and relics, slowly gave way to a world of philosophy, science, and human dignity. Art and music blossomed in the cities of the South. Johann Sebastian Bach gave soul to faith through sound. Handel, Haydn, and Mozart carried German melodies across Europe. In literature, poets like Goethe and Schiller captured the new balance between reason and emotion. Germany, fragmented in politics, was united in culture. Its thinkers asked not who should rule, but what it meant to be human. Yet beneath this brilliance, the empire itself was dying. The balance of power had made it stagnant, too divided to reform, too old to command loyalty. The emperor ruled in name over 1,000 squabbling lords. Some states flourished, others decayed. All guarded their privileges jealously. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, its shockwaves rippled eastward. The old monarchies trembled, and whispers of liberty, equality, and nationhood began to echo even through the cautious German lands. Then came Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would finally shatter what centuries had failed to change. His armies swept through the empire like a flood through dry reeds. In 1806, after nearly 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. The emperor, Francis II, laid down his crown and declared himself Emperor of Austria instead. The dream of the Holy Empire of the German nation ended without ceremony, replaced by a new and uncertain age. But even as it vanished, the idea of Germany did not die. It lingered in the music of Beethoven, in the writings of poets, in the silent pride of people who called many states home, but shared one language and one longing. The empire had fallen asleep for good, but in its ashes, a new dream was beginning to stir. It would not be holy, nor Roman, nor imperial. It would be something far more dangerous and far more alive, the dream of a single, united Germany. When the Holy Roman Empire dissolved in 1806, it was as if a curtain had fallen on a 1,000-year play. The actors were gone, the stage was empty, and yet the audience, the German people, remained, waiting for the next act. What followed was not silence, but chaos, as if history itself were trying to remember its lines. Napoleon, master of Europe, filled that void with his own script. To him, Germany was a chessboard, and he moved its states like pieces. He swept away old borders, dethroned stubborn princes, and gathered the survivors into a loose confederation of the Rhine, a political puppet show where France pulled every string. The ancient order of dukes, bishops, and free cities crumbled under his touch. The people of Germany, long accustomed to divided loyalties, found themselves living under foreign banners and French law. For some, it was humiliation. For others, a strange awakening. The old medieval privileges and local tyrannies were vanishing, replaced by the idea, dangerous and new, that all men might be citizens, not subjects. Napoleon's code, carried by soldiers instead of scholars, introduced equality before law and the possibility of merit over birth. The irony was bitter. Freedom, it seemed, was arriving on the boots of a conqueror. But even empires of genius must sleep. Napoleon's march into Russia ended in frozen disaster, and by 1813, the German lands began to stir in rebellion. Prussia, once humbled, rallied under a new sense of purpose. Farmers, students, and soldiers rose together, chanting for Freiheit, freedom, and Vaterland, the fatherland. The wars of liberation swept across the countryside, and when Napoleon finally fell, the Germans believed their struggle had earned them something more than just another ruler. What they got instead was the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where kings and diplomats restored the world to its pre-revolutionary shape. Germany was reassembled, not as a nation, but as a German confederation, a cautious collection of 39 states presided over by Austria. On paper, it promised cooperation. In reality, it was a polite cage. The rulers returned to their thrones, and the dream of unity was shelved once again under the weight of old fears. Yet beneath this fragile order, something irreversible was happening. Industrial smoke began to rise over the rivers. Railways linked towns that had once been days apart. Cities grew louder, hungrier, and more alive. The world was shrinking, and the old provincial life could not contain it. Young Germans, educated and restless, gathered in cafes and universities to discuss liberty, rights, and the idea, still half forbidden, of a single German nation. Writers like Heinrich Heine and philosophers like Hegel gave these yearnings a voice. Their words spoke of destiny and spirit, of a people bound by more than borders. Nationalism became not just politics, but poetry, a kind of secular faith. The princes watched nervously as students marched with black, red, gold flags, symbols of a Germany that existed only in their imagination. Prussia, ever disciplined and pragmatic, stood apart, building schools, armies, and industry with quiet determination. Austria, proud but bloated, held the Confederation in its elegant grip. Between them stretched a nation divided by temperament as much as by geography. The thinkers' Germany in the south, the soldiers' Germany in the north. By the 1840s, the pressure was unbearable. Factories roared, bread prices rose, and the people grew impatient. Revolution whispered through the smoke. They had waited centuries for unity, and now the demand was no longer poetic. It was practical, urgent, and loud. In 1848, the whisper became a shout. Across Europe, crowds filled the streets demanding freedom, rights, and representation. The old order trembled again, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed that the German dream might finally wake. But history, as always, was not yet ready to grant peace. The age of princes was dying, but the age of nations was not yet born. The German land stood on the edge of change, looking into the storm of revolution that was about to break. And from that storm would rise the man who would shape them, iron-willed, cold-eyed, and ruthless enough to make the dream real. His name was Otto von Bismarck. The year 1848 swept across Europe like a fever. From Paris to Vienna to Berlin, people filled the streets demanding liberty, rights, and recognition. The German states, tired of centuries of disunity and rule by cautious princes, suddenly found their voices raised in the same cry, for freedom and for a single Germany. Barricades went up, flags unfurled, and the air trembled with speeches about democracy, justice, and the destiny of a people long divided. For a moment, it seemed history might turn. Delegates from across the German lands gathered in Frankfurt, forming what would become the Frankfurt Parliament, the first attempt to give Germany a constitution and a soul. They debated day and night beneath the vaulted roof of St. Paul's Church, dreaming of a nation bound not by crowns, but by ideals. But dreams are fragile things. The princes hesitated, the Austrians resisted, and when the crown of a united Germany was finally offered to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, he refused. "I will not accept a crown from the gutter," he said, rejecting the will of the people in favor of divine order. The revolution crumbled. The barricades were torn down, the students scattered, and the dream of 1848 sank under the boots of soldiers. Yet even in defeat, something fundamental had changed. The people had seen what unity might look like, and that vision would not vanish. Prussia, humiliated but unbroken, learned from the chaos. Under the stern eyes of its generals and ministers, it turned inward, rebuilding its strength, not with slogans, but with steel. Factories multiplied, railways webbed the land, and an army of unmatched discipline grew in silence. It was in this world that a man of immense cunning and ambition rose. Otto von Bismarck, a conservative aristocrat who understood that ideas alone could not forge a nation. Power, he believed, would. Bismarck became minister-president of Prussia in 1862, and with him began a new kind of politics. Realpolitik, the art of the possible, the ruthless pursuit of goals without illusion. He looked upon the failed revolutions with cold amusement. Not by speeches and votes of the majority, he said, but by blood and iron. To many, he was cynical. To history, he was inevitable. His first move was to strengthen Prussia's military against parliamentary resistance. His second was to test his new weapon. In 1864, Prussia and Austria together invaded Denmark, claiming the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. It was a brief, victorious war. But behind Bismarck's diplomacy lay calculation. Once the prize was won, he provoked Austria itself, ensuring that the next war would be between the two German giants. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War began, a 6-week lightning strike that shattered the old order. Prussia's modernized army crushed Austria at Königgrätz, and with that, centuries of Austrian dominance over Germany ended. Bismarck, careful not to humiliate his enemy too deeply, negotiated peace quickly. He wanted unity, not vengeance. From the ruins of war, he created the North German Confederation, binding the northern states under Prussian leadership while leaving the South independent, for now. But destiny moved quickly. In 1870, a dispute over the Spanish throne spiraled into a confrontation with France. Bismarck, ever the manipulator, edited a telegram from King Wilhelm I to make it sound insulting to Napoleon III. The French declared war, exactly as he had planned. The southern German states, fearful of invasion, rallied to Prussia's side. For the first time, German soldiers fought together, not as Saxons or Bavarians or Prussians, but as Germans. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 ended with a stunning victory. French armies collapsed. Napoleon III was captured. On a cold January day in 1871, in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German princes gathered around King Wilhelm I of Prussia and hailed him as Emperor of a united Germany. The old dream, born in Charlemagne's coronation, reforged through centuries of fire and faith, had finally awakened. But this was not the holy empire of the past. It was an empire of iron and industry. The new Germany was proud, disciplined, and modern. Its unity won not by faith, but by calculation. Bismarck had given it form, but beneath the triumph, he knew the truth. Every empire carries its own seeds of restlessness. The empire would rise now into power and prosperity, building machines, armies, and ambition. Yet the same fire that had forged it would one day threaten to consume it. For now, though, Germany stood awake, powerful, united, and dreaming of greatness. Germany was born in triumph, not through prayer or poetry, but through strategy, iron, and war. In 1871, the air in the Hall of Mirrors still smelled of smoke and victory. The French Empire lay in ruins, and the German Empire had risen in its place, a newborn giant in the heart of Europe. Bismarck's creation was both a marvel and a monster, efficient, modern, and restlessly proud. The decades that followed were an age of astonishing transformation. Railways stitched the new empire together. Coal and iron poured from the Ruhr, and factories hummed like the pulse of an awakening machine. Cities grew, skylines darkened with industry. Berlin, once provincial, became a metropolis of ambition. Steam engines, telegraphs, and laboratories replaced monasteries as symbols of progress. Germany, long divided, now found unity in motion. But beneath the hum of machines beat a heart still uncertain of itself. The new empire was ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm I, dignified and cautious, and guided by Bismarck's calculating mind. The Chancellor knew that Germany's sudden rise had frightened Europe. Surrounded by rivals, France humiliated, Russia watchful, Britain uneasy, he built a web of alliances to keep the peace. His diplomacy was a chess game played with empires, every move designed to prevent encirclement. For 20 years, it worked. At home, Germany prospered. The middle class swelled, universities flourished, and German science became the envy of the world. Men like Siemens, Benz, and Einstein turned ideas into inventions, propelling the nation into the modern age. Yet prosperity did not quiet the restlessness of power. The empire was a young colossus, eager to prove itself, and ambition began to outgrow prudence. When Kaiser Wilhelm II inherited the throne in 1888, everything changed. He was impulsive, where his grandfather was patient; theatrical, where Bismarck had been subtle. He dismissed the old chancellor, declaring that Germany would have its place in the sun. The empire that had been built on caution now chased glory. Colonies were seized in Africa and the Pacific. A navy was built to rival Britain's. The industrial empire turned outward, hungry for recognition and respect. National pride grew louder, often echoing into arrogance. Newspapers spoke of destiny, of a people chosen to lead Europe into the future. But the louder the empire shouted, the more nervous its neighbors became. Alliances shifted, old friendships cooled, and the continent began to divide into armed camps. Germany, despite all its brilliance, was tightening its own noose. By 1914, the world was a powder keg, and a single spark, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, set it alight. The alliances that were meant to keep peace now dragged Europe into war. Germany, bound to Austria, faced Russia and France. Britain joined to protect Belgium. The First World War began not as a deliberate act of empire, but as the inevitable consequence of too much pride and too little restraint. The early months were full of confidence. German troops marched through Belgium with songs and banners, convinced they'd be home by Christmas. But the modern world had changed the nature of war. Machine guns, trenches, and gas turned battlefields into graves. The Western Front froze into mud and misery. Millions died for lines on a map that barely moved. At home, food grew scarce and patience thinner. The empire's glittering image of progress began to crack. The government tightened control, propaganda filled the air, and dissent was treated as betrayal. Yet behind the lines, the war machine kept turning, relentless, mechanical, inhuman. By 1918, the strain was unbearable. The United States entered the war. The Allies surged forward. Germany's armies, exhausted, began to collapse. In the cities, hunger turned to protest, protest to revolt. The Kaiser fled to exile, and the empire that had been born in the Hall of Mirrors died in the streets of Berlin. What followed was confusion, not defeat alone, but disbelief. How could a nation so strong, so industrious, fall apart so completely? The answer was buried beneath the ruins: power without purpose, unity without humility. Out of the wreckage, a new Germany would rise again, fragile, uncertain, and haunted by the ghosts of its own ambition. The guns fell silent, but the echo of empire would linger in every silence, every hunger, every dream of what might have been. And in that uneasy quiet, another story began, one not of emperors and generals, but of a people struggling to find themselves after the storm. The war ended not with victory, but with silence. In November 1918, the Kaiser slipped away into exile, and the guns of the Western Front finally went still. The empire that had risen in glory collapsed overnight, leaving Germany stunned, starving, and leaderless. Soldiers limped home through snow and ruins. Cities once alive with parades were now filled with widows and beggars. The proud machine of industry had become a machine of ghosts. From the chaos emerged something entirely new, a republic. In the city of Weimar, delegates gathered to write a constitution for a modern democratic Germany. It promised freedom of speech, equality, and representation, ideals that had once been only whispers in cafes and classrooms. For a brief, trembling moment, hope returned. The Weimar Republic was born, fragile but brave, like a candle lit in a storm. Yet even as it flickered to life, forces gathered to snuff it out. The peace treaty signed at Versailles humiliated Germany. The nation was forced to take full blame for the war, surrender its colonies, reduce its army, and pay crushing reparations. To the world, it was justice. To Germans, it was humiliation turned into law. Hunger, inflation, and anger spread faster than recovery. Banknotes lost value by the hour. People carried wages in wheelbarrows. Middle-class families, once stable and proud, watched their savings dissolve into worthless paper. Extremes began to rise where the center could not hold. Communists dreamed of revolution. Monarchists plotted restoration. Paramilitary groups filled the streets, their flags and fists clashing in the night. The fragile republic seemed to sway between chaos and control, between dream and nightmare. Still, amid the turbulence, brilliance bloomed. Berlin in the 1920s was unlike any city on earth. Wild, wounded, alive. Jazz spilled from nightclubs, artists painted defiance, and writers captured the pulse of a generation trying to forget. Architects built with steel and glass, rejecting old forms for modern ones. Films like Metropolis turned fear into art. Germany had lost its empire, but found its imagination. Then, for a few brief years, it seemed the storm might finally pass. Under the Dawes Plan, foreign loans stabilized the economy. Streets filled again with laughter and light. The 1928 elections brought moderates to power. It was, at last, a fragile calm. But calm can be deceptive, especially when built on borrowed time. In 1929, the Great Depression shattered the illusion. The stock market crash in America rippled across the Atlantic like a tidal wave. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared. Once again, despair filled the air. And in that despair, a new voice rose. Confident, angry, promising order where chaos reigned. His name was Adolf Hitler. A failed artist turned demagogue, he spoke to a wounded nation's pride and pain. He offered simple answers to impossible questions. Blame instead of truth. Crowds gathered in the thousands to hear his fiery words. To many, he seemed the only man strong enough to make Germany stand tall again. To others, he was a shadow of what they feared most, the death of freedom disguised as salvation. By 1933, the candle that had flickered since Weimar was guttering. The Republic, besieged from all sides, collapsed into dictatorship. The parliament burned. The constitution was shredded. Democracy, so carefully written in Weimar's quiet halls, ended without a sound. The lullaby was over. The dream of freedom had turned into a nightmare of control. And as night fell again over Germany, the world began to hold its breath. Because this time, the storm would not stay within its borders. When the Weimar Republic fell, it didn't crash so much as dissolve. Quietly, almost hypnotically, one law at a time, one decree after another, the voice of democracy was silenced. By 1933, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, and within months, the machinery of freedom had been replaced by the machinery of fear. The Third Reich was born, not in chaos, but in chilling order. Flags bearing the swastika draped over buildings that had once flown the colors of the Republic. Propaganda filled the air like incense, speeches, parades, radios repeating the same rhythmic promises: unity, strength, destiny. The people, tired of instability and humiliation, wanted to believe. Many did. The rest learned to stay silent. At first, life seemed to improve. The economy revived, jobs returned, highways and factories appeared as if overnight. But beneath that surface of renewal was rot. The price of order was obedience, and obedience soon became worship. Books were burned, ideas outlawed, and dissenters vanished. The state seeped into every aspect of life: the schools, the press, the pulpit, the family. Children sang songs of loyalty. Neighbors watched one another. And then came the persecution. The Nazi ideology, built on racism and delusion, needed an enemy to define itself against. Jews, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled, political opponents, all were branded as threats to the purity of the nation. Step by step, rights were stripped away until humanity itself was outlawed. Synagogues were shattered on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and the streets of Germany glittered with the remains of its conscience. Outside its borders, Germany grew bolder. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Each act met with hesitation from the rest of Europe. Peace in our time, they said, believing compromise could calm a predator. But in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the illusion ended. The Second World War had begun. At first, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, crushed nations in weeks. France fell, Britain burned, and much of Europe bent under the weight of the Reich. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as if Hitler's nightmare of dominance might succeed. But power built on brutality cannot last forever. In 1941, Germany turned east, invading the Soviet Union in a campaign of staggering cruelty. Millions died as entire regions were burned to the ground. The war that began as conquest became annihilation. And behind the front lines, in the shadow of the empire, the Holocaust unfolded, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of others. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became factories of death. Trains arrived full and left empty. Humanity itself seemed to vanish into smoke. By 1943, the tide began to turn. The German army, stretched too far, began to break. The Allies landed in Italy, then in Normandy. Cities that had once been symbols of pride, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, were reduced to ash. The empire built on fear began to devour itself from within. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, Hitler retreated into his bunker. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. When the end came, it came quietly. The man who had promised eternal glory died underground, leaving his country in ruins. When the guns finally fell silent, Germany was a wasteland. Its cities were rubble, its people shattered, its name spoken with horror across the world. The dream of unity had turned into the darkest nightmare in human history. And yet, even amid the ruins, survivors began to whisper of something else, of rebuilding, of atonement, of a future that might somehow rise from shame. The old empire was gone, the Reich reduced to dust, but Germany's story was not over. It would awaken again, but this time it would awaken divided. When the war ended, Germany did not rise from its knees. It collapsed into the dust. Cities lay in ruins, bridges twisted like skeletons, and families searched the wreckage for the living. The world looked upon this broken land, not with pity, but with judgment. The crimes of the Third Reich hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. The Germany that had once called itself eternal was now occupied, humbled, and forced to face what it had become. The victors divided the spoils, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, carved the country into 4 zones of control. Berlin, once the empire's glittering heart, was split down the middle, its streets severed by barbed wire and soldiers' boots. From the ashes of one nation, 2 were born. In the West, under American and British guidance, rose the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. It was built on democracy, capitalism, and Reconstruction. The Marshall Plan poured in aid, and soon factories buzzed again, rebuilding not just the economy, but pride. Streets once filled with rubble now glittered with neon lights. A new generation grew up believing that hard work and trust could heal even the deepest wounds. In the East, under Soviet control, emerged the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. It was a state born from ideology, promising equality through socialism, but delivered control through surveillance. The Stasi, its secret police, watched everything and everyone. Life was orderly, predictable, and gray. People were fed, educated, and fearful. 2 Germanys, 2 dreams. One looked westward toward freedom and prosperity, the other eastward toward ideology and control. Both believed they were the real Germany. And between them stood the Berlin Wall, built in 1961, a wall of concrete and shame. Families were torn apart overnight. Streets that once led to a neighbor's house now ended in silence. Soldiers patrolled the barrier, and escape attempts often ended in gunfire. The wall was more than a border. It was a scar carved across a people's heart. Yet, life persisted. In West Germany, the post-war miracle, or Wirtschaftswunder, transformed ruins into prosperity. Volkswagen factories, bustling ports, new cities rising from concrete dust. It was as if the nation had learned to rebuild faster than it could mourn. The capital, Bonn, was modest, the politics cautious, but behind that restraint lay determination to never fall into darkness again. In East Germany, life followed a different rhythm. Workers marched under red flags, schools taught loyalty to the party, and the state declared itself the defender of peace. Yet, beneath the slogans, longing simmered. People tuned their radios to forbidden Western stations, catching distant echoes of rock music and freedom. The wall might have divided land, but it could not divide curiosity. The Cold War made Germany the front line of global tension. Foreign soldiers stood guard, not as conquerors now, but as sentinels of 2 rival worlds. American bases dotted the west. Soviet tanks lined the east. Each side watched the other across minefields and ideology. The German question, of who they were and which dream was true, became the world's question too. By the 1980s, change was coming again. The East grew weary. The West grew confident. Soviet power began to wane, and whispers of reform drifted across the Iron Curtain. In 1989, the whispers became shouts. Crowds filled the streets of East Berlin, not with fear, but with songs. Soldiers hesitated, orders faltered, and suddenly, miraculously, the wall opened. People climbed it, danced on it, and began to tear it apart with their hands. For the first time in decades, Germany was whole again. Strangers embraced in the cold November air as if waking from a long shared dream. The next year, 1990, the two Germanys became one. The reunification was not just political, it was emotional, spiritual, generational. The world watched as the divided heart of Europe began to beat as one. But unity came with questions. What did it mean to be German now? Could a nation so scarred by history, so fractured by ideology, truly become whole again? The answers would not come quickly. Yet for the first time in a century, they would be sought not in battlefields or empires, but in classrooms, in conversations, in art, in peace. The long sleep of division was over. The German story had opened its eyes once more. Older, humbler, but still dreaming. The night the Berlin Wall fell, history seemed to hold its breath. After decades of division, after generations raised on opposite sides of a concrete scar, Germany was one again. People crossed the old checkpoints in disbelief, crying, laughing, carrying flowers, waving flags. Strangers embraced like family, and for a few precious hours, it felt as if time itself had healed. But unity, as Germany soon learned, was not a magic word. It was work. The two halves of the nation had lived separate lives for nearly half a century. Different economies, different educations, even different ways of thinking. The euphoria of reunification gave way to the practical struggle of stitching the country back together. In the East, industries collapsed under the sudden weight of capitalism. Unemployment soared. In the West, people whispered that they were paying for someone else's mistakes. The dream of one Germany was alive, but fragile. Through the 1990s, the nation rebuilt once more. Berlin, reclaimed as the capital, became a symbol of reinvention. Cranes filling its skyline, artists turning the scars of division into canvases. The city pulsed with new energy, restless, creative, and uncertain. Germany was redefining itself, not as an empire or ideology, but as a democracy rooted in memory and responsibility. Yet, the past was never far away. Every conversation about the future carried the echo of what had come before. The wars, the walls, the moral reckoning. Schools taught history with precision and pain. Memorials rose where atrocities had occurred. The new Germany would not forget. It would not allow forgetting to become comfort. The 21st century brought fresh tests. The European Union, once a dream of peace among former enemies, became Germany's new stage. Its economy, rebuilt on discipline and exports, became the engine of Europe. The euro replaced the mark. Borders opened. For the first time in centuries, Germany led without conquest, through commerce, culture, and compromise. But success carried unease. Economic power made Germany both admired and resented. The global crises of the 2000s, financial crashes, migration, climate, pressed on its conscience. The world again looked to Berlin for leadership, and Germany, cautious as ever, hesitated between pride and guilt. Chancellor Angela Merkel, calm and pragmatic, guided the country through turmoil with quiet authority, becoming a symbol of stability in a shifting world. At home, unity deepened, but never became perfect. The scars of division lingered in small towns and silent resentments. In the East, nostalgia for the old order mixed with frustration over inequality. In the West, prosperity sometimes hardened into complacency. New generations, born after the wall, grew up without memory of it, speaking of Europe and the future more than Germany itself. And yet, the identity that once tore the nation apart had become something subtle and strong. Germany learned that being united did not mean being simple, that contradictions could coexist, memory and progress, pride and humility, order and creativity. Today, the country stands at the center of Europe, not as a conqueror, not as a dream, but as a balance. It builds machines that move the world and hosts debates that test its soul. Its cities hum with invention. Its people wrestle openly with their past. In a way, that struggle is its greatest strength. The story that began with Charlemagne's crown and drifted through empires, Reformation, wars, and walls ends, for now, not in triumph, but in awareness. Germany is no longer chasing unity. It is living it, imperfectly and honestly. And as the lights of modern Berlin reflect off the Spree at night, the centuries seem to whisper together. The monks of Aachen, the poets of Weimar, the soldiers of Prussia, the dreamers of 1848, the voices lost and the voices reborn. The empire that once dreamed of eternity has found something better: continuity. The dream did not die. It changed shape. It became a country awake, aware, and still learning how to live with its history, not as a burden, but as a heartbeat.